Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices and masters alike. I am, of course, Dan. My co-host is, of course, Josh.
Hello.
The Earth Online developer.
Good evening, everyone.
I'll let Josh get a word in edgewise here. One of these days we'll have timing. And on this podcast, we'll be discussing all things Earthdawn, both magical and mechanical. Today is chronological and combatical and whatever. I'm just going to keep that trope going.
You did say you were going to try and keep that riff going as long as you could.
I'm gonna try. And as long as I find it funny, I don't care what anybody else thinks. But please, by all means, we actually have a listener email to get to today, first thing. And after that, actually before that, we'd like to remind everybody, if you possibly can, we know we've got more than 2 listeners. We've only had 3 emails so far. But by all means, please get a hold of us and contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, like and subscribe and everything else to make the algorithms work on your favorite podcast platform. But otherwise, Josh, we have an email.
We do. We got an email from Matt, who sent one of the emails that we had in a previous episode. Thank
you, Matt.
So we appreciate that. It says, "Hello, guys. I liked very much the last episodes, which thank you for that. We appreciate it. Which got me thinking about questions that I have." And he has 2 questions. 1, can you do an episode on the current political climate of Barsaive? I know the Iopos book, which is forthcoming, should have some of it, but I'm not sure how much it will. Having some more information about the aftermath on page 38 and 39 of the GM guide would be great. I'm currently running a game based in Bartertown, so I just want to find out what has changed. So that is something that we will probably talk about when we get a little bit further along in the timeline. Which will be a couple of episodes. We've got some more timeline advancement stuff we're going to talk about tonight. And when we get to the end of the timeline, we will sort of talk about the current situation. And also, as we start getting into geographical stuff where we are looking at different areas, we'll probably bring up what is going on currently in them as of the time of sort of 4th edition status, or if there's a book related to them, talk about the stuff in there. So it is.
In the meantime, put your campaign on hold for like 5 or 6 weeks. Kidding.
Or you can just make stuff up. Anything that is not in a book thus far is largely fair game. All of the stuff that I wanted to point out in terms of differences is in the GM guide. But we'll talk about that more later. The other question he had, too, Josh, why did you change something from 3rd, and why did you keep some? What you said about the Windling Karma die got me thinking of that question. And that is a good question. And that is something that, as we talk about different mechanical stuff or setting-based stuff as we go along, I will sort of address those as they become relevant. It's very difficult to sort of do a comprehensive, just talking about all the changes without coming across them in the course of working on this. That's a pretty
broad brush otherwise.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can imagine you...
Like, I'm not even sure
3 hours
100%
on it,
of...
not even nail everything down.
I'm not even 100% sure. I would basically like needing to go through stuff and say, oh, yeah, here's this. As a general consideration, most of the changes that were made were to address problems or... more likely to try and streamline or simplify play to a certain extent. That was not always the case. Like, for example, the rules changes on poisons are a little bit more complicated than they were previously. But just generally, that's what I was looking towards. We could do a whole show just on Forge Blade, aka Forge Weapon, and all of the changes that it has gone through over the course of the editions. And we may talk about that when we get to Weaponsmiths, and sort of explain why the various changes were made during the editions and why it ended up going back a lot more like the way it originally was.
Fair.
But yeah, I mean, good questions. We're glad that you enjoy the episodes. And those are things that, rather than focusing on like, we'll do a show focused on why changes were, that'll be something that gets discussed as the various stuff comes up. If somebody has a specific question about, like, why did you change X, then, certainly feel free to ask that question. And, that is a lot easier to address than, why did you change some things and keep others? Well, because it
needed to be done. Yeah, because I felt like it.
Yeah. So
and by all means, lay everything on Josh's feet. He's not the only person who made some changes. So,
yeah, I mean, there were changes throughout the entire development of the line, and lessons learned, and things that I contributed to as changes in earlier editions that I reverted in later ones because I am older and have less tolerance for some things.
Beef and cuz. This is why. So
yeah.
We're going to go with that. Cool. So by all means, Matthew, thank you for your email. Stay tuned for more. Is not just a way to get you to listen and continue to listen. We really mean that. We'll get to it in time. We promise. And on behalf of all the other listeners, I will ask a lot of questions of Josh on your behalf. So by all means, send more questions because I don't mind asking. So that leads us to the timeline. And where we left off was just as everybody closed their doors and the Scourge was beginning.
Yes.
Right?
We had sort of wrapped up, I think, with the sort of the final days leading up to the Scourge and the Theron Empire.
So we had it down as the long night begins now. So roughly 1008, the year of Thrall, or 565, the year of Thera. Take your pick. But since we're all pretty much going by the Thrallic calendar, 1008. And they didn't really come out from the surface for like 401 years or something like that. So, this is where the dwarves created the Book of Tomorrow. Everybody was in their own big cares.
Well, there were some little ones.
And, there were some little ones, probably windlings. But mostly, I can't even say racial specific because a lot of them were probably blended, many races involved. And...
outside of like the elven court at Wormwood, which we will talk about here, like many of the Tiskrang homes, the Tiskrang major population centers were largely Tiskrang based because a lot of them were underwater, stuff like that. The Book of Tomorrow, which Dan mentioned, is a really neat conceit setting wise. The Citadel at Thera closed sort of before a lot of other places did, potentially because of the high magic that was there. It could have attracted a lot of attention from the horrors beforehand. And so there was a period of time where, Thera had sealed itself off and was no longer in communication, but a lot of other places were still open. Thrall actually kept themselves open as long as they possibly could to allow for refugees and late arrivals to get safely into the kingdom. But the Book of Tomorrow was something that was commissioned by Thrall to basically provide something to help the people in the cares to look forward.
Rebuild. Yeah, rebuild after they came out.
Right. When you're talking about 400 years, I mean, that's multiple generations, even if you're talking sort of the longer lived elves. But, with people, I mean, 400 years, if we think about that, it's, 2010, we're talking about the amount of time here going back to, before the, right around the founding of Jamestown here in the U.S.
Yes.
Like that's the time scale that we're talking about, like from today to the first permanent English colony in the Americas. That's
Plymouth Rock's what, 1607, 1620, somewhere in there?
1620 was 1620 Jamestown, or was that the landing at Plymouth Rock? I can never remember.
I think it was a landing, but my history. Hey, guess what? 400 years ago, I wasn't there.
Yeah. So I mean,
what we're talking about.
That's a really long chunk of time, and the number of generations and so forth that go on there, and where we've got sealed environments, and not only like the Therans kind of did a lot of work with the rights of protection and passage to have it so that people could survive the Scourge. They didn't really do anything to plan for the time after. It could be, this isn't really in the book at all, but it could be argued that maybe the reason they did that was so that a lot of the places would end up being weaker and whatnot, and no longer, and not put up much of a fight if, when the Therans returned after the Scourge. That is one possibility. But the Dwarves of Thrall commissioned a book and distributed it to as many places as they could, where it included, stories and legends and information about the surface world and how to, do traditional farming as opposed to the magical stuff that was taking place in the cares, and all sorts of other, animal husbandry and all sorts of things that is sort of important knowledge. And also included in it a primer and alphabet and stuff on the Dwarven language, which goes, again, kind of really nice setting conceit as here's a reason why everybody speaks Throlic, speaks the Dwarven language, because the dwarves made an effort during this long period of time to kind of build, in a sense, a unified culture amongst a wide variety of people who had kind of been separate before then. And even though they continued to be separate, when that is the major source of information and whatnot, it becomes very important and helps build a foundation. So they commissioned the book, got it out to as many places as they could beforehand, and then sealed their gates.
Yeah, the year 1050, they finally sealed their gates in Thrall. Because they were, as you said, letting in refugees and everybody else who could possibly make it, just because.
Yeah, that was about 50 years after Thera sealed theirs. So there was a good chunk of time, almost a sort of human lifetime. Well, not quite, but to
a whole generation essentially.
Yeah, to do that. So.
And then, so while everybody was underground, the king, Varulus II at the time, took a while, but they finally came up with the Council Compact in the year 1270 is when it was finalized. Mm-hmm. So it took him 120 years? Yeah, 120 years. No, sorry, 220 years. 1050 to 1270. 220 years to write a legal document. Wow. But it laid out individual rights, property rights, and the role of law, and figured out that in the Council Compact, slavery should be outlawed because it was the conclusion was drawn that the body is the property of the soul that inhabits it, and involuntary servitude grants control of the body to the slave owner. So it says, in essence, the Kingdom of Thrall, in its own little care, or own large care, in 1270 decided to outlaw slavery.
Yeah. It's an interesting it's an interesting sort of that they kind of take a property rights based approach to outlawing slavery, which is to say that there's a where a slave owner or the slave holding culture that was Thera and sort of the dominant culture prior to the Scourge looked at slaves themselves as property. And so the counter argument that ended up being come up with by the philosophers and scholars of Thrall was, well, okay, if you're going to view them as property, who actually owns that body? And well, then the spirit owns the body. And if you're using the body without consent or without compensation, then you are therefore stealing the body from its rightful owner, and things like that. So it's an interesting approach. And it does a lot to, not that it needed a lot of work, I don't think, but it definitely does a lot to set up the sort of setting conceit of the Therans generally being viewed as bad guys because they keep slaves, and the Kingdom of Thrall and, Barsaive and broadly sort of afterwards has denied that, without the troublesome racial stuff that it goes along with that here in our present day society. But it takes a moral, it's a moral stance, but it is one that is couched in argument terms that are difficult to, in some respects, maybe difficult to gainsay. I mean, you can, and the Therans do it all the time, but, some Therans do it all the time. But just in general, it's an interesting approach. And, basically that the sort of that is an indication. It's not the only thing that was done, but it is an indication of how throughout the Scourge, the dwarfs of Thrall were not just sitting on their butts, like, twiddling their thumbs. They were actively working towards trying to figure out, okay, well, when this is over, when we get through this, again, like looking at that hopeful post-apocalypse kind of situation, when we get through this, what is the kind of world that we want to build in the aftermath, and making those decisions and laying the philosophical foundation for it ahead of time, and well enough ahead of time. We're talking like it was sort of revealed in 1270, which is about halfway through the Scourge, roughly speaking. There is enough time after that is established within Thrall for that to become the cultural norm. Like, it's not like they opened the cares and then sort of dropped this new on everybody. For the kingdom, it's something that had, in large part, sort of become internalized, even if there are factions within Thrall that, are not crazy about some of the things that were decided or laid down in that.
Yeah. And there's roughly, as you said, 200 years left. And so that's plenty of time, 3, 4, 5 generations-ish, to get used to the new norm of this is no longer a practice.
Right.
And so they had generations to imbue that to the society as a whole. So, like as I said, that was a very cool thing for the setting conceit. So about 400 years after the beginning of the Scourge, in the year 1415, the elemental ball of true earth stopped falling into the dish of true water and stayed there about an inch above and stabilized.
Yes.
And I always thought that was a really cool, magical way to tell time for the Scourge to be over with. I always thought that was a neat thing because clocks, candles, no sundial, you're all underground.
Right.
So how would they do it? And then they relied on the elements and true earth and true water to get that done. So I thought that was a very cool thing to get done.
Yeah. And that's, because that's something that is, at least in theory, based on the level of magic. If the Scourge and the presence of the horrors is something that's, based on, like, there can only come through when the magic is at a certain level, you have something magical that kind of measures what that level is at, and when it's down below a certain point, then you know that that it's not. Now, one of the unanswered mysteries of Earthdawn is why did it stop dropping?
We're not going to tell you here.
We're not going to tell you here. There are enough clues in old material that the people who have dug into it have a pretty good idea. But yeah, like that's one of the things, at least certainly in the core book, is like, magic dropped and stabilized and has been stable now for 150 years. With no indication that it's dropping further, and
increasing,
or increasing, and what does that mean in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah. So if you want to go read all the old source material, challenge accepted. Go for it.
Or if you want to, hit me up on, you want to send an email or hit up the company Discord or stuff. I can probably have it pried out of me.
Yeah, Josh will maybe just say yes or no to the certain emailer.
Or I could use the great developer response to people who put forward ideas, which is, that's a really interesting idea.
Tell me more.
That's a good question.
Yeah, love that. So in the meantime, what happens also during the long night here during the Scourge is King Varulus I dies at 270, and Varulus II takes up the throne.
The throne, yeah.
And then also he dies in 1373, so just 25, 30 years before the doors open for the first search party. And so King Varulus III. So King Varulus I saw the outside, and King Varulus III saw the outside. King Varulus II never saw the outside.
Never did. No, and if you look at it, the Throllic kings during the Scourge all have much longer lifespans than is normal for dwarfs, according to the racial information. Dwarfs don't typically live that much longer than sort of baseline humans. About 100 years is sort of the typical lifespan. But Varulus I died at almost 300. Valorous II died at 258. Valorous III took the throne in 1373 and was alive until he was killed in the early 1500s. So he was also like of well advanced age. And the reason for that is not a secret. Valorous the First went to visit the great dragon Icewing, who lives atop the Thrall Mountains, and was gifted potions that would greatly extend the life of himself and his heirs. The idea being by having a long-lived monarch, would promote a much more stable society and prevent the possibility, reduce the possibility, not necessarily prevent it, but reduce the possibility of civil war or some other kind of thing where, there could be some problems with Thrall. The drawback of those potions is that it greatly reduced the fertility of the royal family to the point that Valorous III only had one heir, and the royal family was very, very small, sort of post-Scourge and in the time after that, which is kind of a bad thing in dwarf culture, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to dwarves, but that basically there was one heir, and we'll talk about the consequences of that in another timeline episode, because that's, that's about 150 years off from where we're talking about right now.
Exactly. And we've got like 2 more segments of the timeline to get through on other episodes.
Right.
So stay tuned. So other than that, the Gates of Thrall finally opened in the summer. I love the fact that it's summer. 1420, after the first expedition went out in 1412 and got crushed. And then they did one every year after that.
Well, 1412 actually was the first expedition that did not get killed within... Oh,
sorry. Right.
Yeah. 1409 was the first expeditions. 1412 was the first one that actually succeeded, where the party came back with news that it was, potentially safe. Safer. And then they set forth on the Earthdawn, which was the ship after which the game is named.
Yes.
And it went on 2 expeditions and vanished on the third.
It went on one that was successful, and then it went on a second one and disappeared.
It disappeared during the second one. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
And its fate is as yet unknown.
Which is strange, because the Earthdawn went on 2 expeditions, and most of the game is based on the rule of 3. So I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
That there are rumors and stories of it appearing in the skies from time to time. But as of right now, officially speaking, its fate is undetermined. And I think unless we can come up with something really compelling or interesting for it, we may just leave that as an open mystery for people to decide what to do with in their own games.
I like that idea because once upon a time I was playing a game with a really big bad guy, and if you give the great big bad guy stats, then there's a way to defeat him. Mm-hmm. Him or her. If you don't ever stat that guy, the numbers will never succeed. And so if you never have a mystery solved, it's fun to have that always out there, that it could eventually pop in on your group or in your campaign or something like that. So you get to do whatever you want with the Earthdawn that way.
Yeah, and I certainly understand the desire for some of the more hardcore lore heads to want to know what happens and to have all of the details filled in. And I appreciate that as someone who is sort of one of those, at least peripherally. But I also recognize the value in having blank spaces on the map. And that includes, mysteries that we just won't answer. And to allow game masters to come up with their own ideas to tie into those things. At least as of right now, the fate of the Earthdawn is one of those. Much like there is very, very little information that has been revealed about the Kingdom of Landis, and even less about Ustrecht, which was the troll kingdom that was sort of contemporaneous with Carafod, and that those areas have not had a lot of detail about them, which makes them really great areas for a GM maybe to develop and flesh out on their own. There is a lot of empty space on the map. But it's nice to also have some areas that maybe just have a little bit of labels. You always want to have an area, when you're talking about fantasy gaming at least, I think it's important and useful to have areas on the map or at the edges of the map where all you have is, here there be dragons. Or that we don't have much information, about them to allow people to fill in blanks. And, they might be filled in later. They might serve as inspiration for later stuff or not. But don't feel like you can't use something that you have an idea about because we haven't detailed it more. Because, it might take us a lot longer to get to it. And in the meantime, you can, do cool stuff. So.
Yeah, and part of the basis of Earthdawn is exploration, because something may not have been fully explored in the last 100 and some odd years that we've been out. So
and
go explore it.
We really want people to make the game their own in a sense, and it is very difficult to do that if we have decided what's going on with something but are very cagey about it and hiding the secrets from people. And then when we reveal it, the secrets turn out to be kind of not great, which is a problem with some of the heavier meta plot stuff from the same era in the 90s.
Yes.
And I don't think, while there was a developing storyline for Earthdawn, I think it was one of the better examples of that in terms of all of the products that they came out. So we're trying to do more of the same.
My best real-world example, I can't say real-world, my best movie example of this is if you watch the movie Ronin with Robert De Niro, they're chasing this suitcase, this briefcase across half of Europe, and the filmmakers decided that they would never reveal what was in the case because it's not going to be as cool as you ever would think it would be, and so you're going to get lost on the storyline going, well, what's in the case? It can't be that important. It has to be that important. They're chasing after it. And so by not knowing what's in the case ever, you focus on the story of who's doing what and why.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the case in Pulp Fiction works the same way. They never show what's inside. They just open it up at one point. And you kind of see a glow, whether that is an actual glow or merely a metaphorical one, given the way that Tarantino does things. You never really know. But the case in both of those is it's just a MacGuffin. It's the reason why things are happening. And beyond that, you don't need to know the details.
You don't need to know. Yeah. So
no, it's
go from there.
It's cool.
Yeah.
So there were So question for you. There were two other things that happened during the Scourge.
Oh, God.
That we need to talk about briefly.
Yes.
We focused mainly on Thrall and what was going on with Thrall and the stuff that they did, but there were two other kind of significant events that happened during the Scourge that I kind of flagged that we should talk about.
Sorry about that. I think one of them is the Ritual of Thorns with the elves.
Yes, that is one.
There's one.
Yep.
And I didn't quite see the note on the second one, but I just remembered that one off the top of my head.
Okay, so what? Enlighten us about the Ritual of Thorns.
I'll do what I can. My memory is still fuzzy, as it always is. I remember that the wards they had Queen Alachia had gone around and said that they didn't need the rites of protection and passage. Their elementalists were doing just fine, thank you very much, and they strengthened their forest and used true wood to create their barrier and grow their trees, and that was their outside. But as we all know, wood, unless it's petrified, is not as strong as stone, and so those wards eventually began to break down, and somebody, nobody quite knows who, figured out that when the horrors did breach, they left alone anybody who was already in pain, and so thus began if we hurt ourselves, then we don't feed the horrors, and they will leave us alone. And so Alachia decreed at that point that anybody who was in the Bloodwood needed to go through the Ritual of Thorns to keep and protect the longevity of the elven race.
Yes.
How did I do?
That's pretty good. What exactly does the Ritual of Thorns do?
It causes thorns, spiky little things, to grow from inside your body, probably from your bones itself, through your flesh, through your skin, and out of your skin by about an inch or 2 inches, depending upon how well you like that transformation. And even some of the more grotesque ones actually continue to drip blood every once in a while. Those are fun.
Well, not just the grotesque ones, all of them.
Yes, sorry.
Because yeah, but they all dripped blood constantly.
Which is why elves don't wear white.
Yeah, there is a much more detailed sort of description of what was going on with this in both the original first edition Bloodwood book and the more recent Elven Nations, which adapts a lot of the Bloodwood material to fourth edition. But historically, setting wise, they're pretty much the same. I mean, you more or less nailed it, or you sort of more or less nailed the public story of what was going on with those there. The idea being that the thorns growing out and dripping blood cause constant pain, and so therefore the more powerful horrors, the ones that are more dangerous, generally need to apparently create the negative feelings they feed on themselves, and so don't have as much of an interest in the blood elves. And so the weaker ones, who are largely there to just eat stuff, are able to be driven off. The secret of this, and this gets mentioned in the GM's guide, in the setting section of the GM's guide, is that the other aspect of the Ritual of Thorns, which is the not publicly known, is that it was also basically renaming the wood and altering its pattern so that the pattern of the wood itself would be a ward against horrors. And the reason that the thorns from the elves continue to drip blood is to continue to power that enchantment. Which is
a very, very cool little tidbit for setting.
I mean, there's more to it. The even people who have never played Earthdawn but who have encountered it, the blood elves are memorable. Honestly,
yes.
And we will talk more about. We'll have to do maybe a whole episode on them. But the blood elves are really an interesting take on the whole thing. They do things with elves that are Earthdawn did something with elves that was different in a truly remarkable way. The blood elves are not, here's Earthdawn's version of the drow.
Drow.
It's a very different, there's this whole thing with the elves and the ones that were not at the wood and so don't have the ritual, and the blood elves, and they survived, but what was the cost? And there is so, I can go on about the Alakia and the blood elves for hours. I just
and the disdain from elves who have not gone through the Ritual of Thorns, who look upon those who did, and just there's something there that's just I don't know what to make of you, but I don't like
what
it, and
was,
so forth. And
what was the center of elven culture, the thing that defined what it was to be an elf, was so. I don't want it the word irrevocably doesn't it applies in a sense because it changed it so dramatically that the elves outside the wood no longer really know what it means. And there's this whole thing about with the ritual, and I go and get the Elven Nations books and read, because there's a lot of discussion in there about what it means and why Alakia, even now 100 years after the Scourge, is still requiring that the ritual be performed. And there's all sorts of, it gets sort of alluded to in the GM guide, the 4th edition GM guide, but the blood elves are amazing. They really are. And just, so that's,
if anyone says drow elves are better in D&D, I'll see your drow elves and I'll raise you the blood elves and we'll go to blows. Because I think the blood elves absolutely mop the floor.
It's just, I mean, I don't want to compare their different things, but it, again, as a response to the 2nd edition D&D, AD&D thing, a lot of other fantasy games always tried to kind of do their own take on quote unquote dark elves that always whatever. But the blood elves are not really dark elves, but there's that. Anyway, it's all just it's super creepy and has the horror aspect and the tragedy, and it's amazing. And they are iconic in a truly unique Earthdawn way.
Yes.
So that's that.
And all the artwork in the books forever for the blood elves has just been fantastic. So they've always had the right artists for those.
The other event.
Is this the passions being driven mad?
Yeah, that actually wasn't what I was thinking of, though. The other one was Parlainth.
Right. Sorry. So obvious we missed it because it was a box set once upon a time. But yes. The other part of Parlainth, because I did read the Longing Ring trilogy many, many years ago. But that was when, because other people had ideas about how to survive the Scourge and how best to protect themselves.
Parlainth was the Theron capital before the Scourge.
Yes. And what they decided to do instead was just when the balance is tipped to take their city, it's in its entirety, city population and everything around it, and just pop that to a little pocket dimension of astral space and kind of switch places with the horrors, because the horrors were coming here, they would go there, and do the whole like baseball pickle. You didn't catch me, I'm over here now, and wait it out. But then as part of that,
so there was yes. Let's see. No, go ahead. You were going to, as part of that.
I was going to say, they decided to erase from existence and everybody's memories all of the existence of Parlainth. So nobody would remember that Parlainth even existed for the horrors to find out where it could possibly be. So the ultimate presto changeo switcheroo, Parlainth disappeared and disappeared from everybody's memory and disappeared from every book, every map, period.
Yeah, except for a few very obscure references that basically led to clues to how to bring it back.
Yes.
The idea, of course, was that the Therans living in Parlainth would bring it back themselves once the Scourge was over. That was part of the original plan.
A little hubris there.
Yeah. There was one problem, and that is that when they performed the ritual to remove the city into its pocket space, there were already horrors that had infiltrated the city.
Yeah. They kind of piggybacked on that one. They said, oh, you think you will? Oh, no, you won't.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't that the horrors like knew what they were going to do. The horrors were just doing what they do, which was infiltrating the city. And then when they discovered what had happened and that they were trapped in the city for the duration of the Scourge, they were not happy, and so extended the torment of the people within it for a long period of time.
Because if you're a horror and you figure out that you're going to have this nice bountiful 12-course meal for the next 400 years, and then you end up in the city where you're going to have like an appetizer for 400 years, you'd be a little upset too.
Yeah. And so in the aftermath of the Scourge, there was there was a magical artifact called the Longing Ring, of which there was a novel about it. And the novel basically describes the rediscovery and return of the city of Parlainth. But basically, Parlainth, when it was discovered, was empty. That is to say, well, no, it wasn't empty. It was like none of the people that had gone into the city originally had survived. All that were left were horrors and horror constructs and undead.
Yes.
And a lot of the horrors sort of had actually gone into semi-hibernation because they had no longer had any kind of, food source. But when the city returned, then they kind of woke back up, and some of them and whatever. But Parlainth is basically to draw a parallel, it is perhaps like the Undermountain of Earthdawn. Undermountain being the massive dungeon that exists under the city of Waterdeep in the Forgotten Realms. And Parlainth is just basically a massive ruined city full of monsters and treasure and stuff. And there's a little outpost, safe outpost on the corner of the city that's been established. But it is, just a big, massive ruined city. With all of the awesomeness that goes along with it. And the original box set, the Parlainth box set, is amazing, has some phenomenal handouts with it.
Agreed.
There are two things about Parlainth that stand out, and then we'll kind of wrap this up, at least to me. One is the description how there's the city wall, right? The wall that basically encompassed the city and was the bricks of which were the foundation of the enchantment that moved it to the other plane.
Yes.
And there is a space between where the wall was, because the wall was constructed for the purpose of the ritual, and where the border of the city actually was. It's a space of, a few dozen yards or so. And there's a description in the box set of that area, which more or less goes around the entire perimeter of the city, is largely just filled with bones. Like, you know, the scenes that they show of the future in the Terminator movies, where like you usually have like all of the skulls and stuff, and then the robot like steps on it, and like that's the kind of area that is the perimeter of Parlainth. I always use that to great effect when people arrive there the first time. The other one is one of the handouts in the Parlainth box set that always stuck with me, and that is, it is a fragment of a journal or something that was, or is basically was a journal, for lack of a better term, that was recorded on a wall in a part of the city.
Yes.
It was painted on the wall. You probably know the one I'm talking about now.
The great map wall, yes.
No, not the Great Map Wall. This is something else entirely. This is basically like in a room in a part of the ruins. Basically, like it's like, we have been in here for 13 days, and like it's basically like a journal, a chronicle of what's been going on. And it gets to the end, and like the person who is writing it is like, I can't let the horror who has trapped us see that I'm doing this, and I've got to blah blah blah. And like at one point, about two-thirds or three-quarters of the way through this sort of journal that's been describing like, oh, and they came and took so-and-so today, and like he came back and he didn't have an arm, and like there's all this like kind of vague allusions to the nasty stuff that's been going on and whatnot. The paint pot that he has been using to, like, he gets caught off guard and knocks over the paint pot and spills the paint, and he's like, oh, well, I guess this is the last of it. And then like the next entry is, I woke up the next morning and there was a fresh pot of paint there. And the horror was like, no, keep writing because we want people to remember us too. And he's like, I'm not going to write anymore. Like that was like, that's how it ended. And when I had a group that spent a little bit of time in Parlainth and basically gave that handout to like the party wizard, who was the only one who could read Theron, which is what it was written in, and handed it to him, and he read it, and I swear the player went pale when he got towards the end of it, and everybody else went, what? He's like, no, you don't want to know. He just handed the sheet back to me. He's like, no, you don't know. You're better off not knowing.
Telling him that.
No. And that, it's like some of the stuff in the horrors book, there is some really, really, really good atmospheric, moody writing that just shows up throughout, and like that handout is an example of one of it. Just some really creative, like short story stuff.
The characterizations of everybody in Parlainth, and not to get off on a side topic too much, were fantastic. I had my group go to Vestrial and sign all of her contracts, and I literally printed up 100 contracts. Vartigal, sorry, Vartigal's
Vestrial is the Mad Passion.
Thank you. I got stuck on Mad Passions when I asked you that question. Went to her lore exchange, and I literally printed up 100 copies of those contracts and made all my players sign them in their own characters' names, and just ad nauseum. And so they got to be frustrated with her like you normally would, just go, I'd have to sign another contract, and the whole thing. So the characterizations of everybody in Parlainth is fantastic. If you don't have the box set, because it's not in 4th edition, go get the box set off eBay somewhere or
electronically. It is available in PDF with all of the handouts and everything else.
Nice. Yes, FosseGames.com. Go there. By all means, yes. So that should cover the Scourge. We'll get to the Passions Going Mad later on. Yeah,
we'll fit that in at some point. The actual first indications that they did was kind of early in the Scourge. But we'll deal with that another time.
Yeah, when we get to the Passions. So about 45 minutes in or so, I think we've got time for one of our topics left.
Yeah,
how about we just cover the general broad strokes of everybody's favorite part of Earthdawn, combat.
Well, I don't know that it's everybody's favorite part, but it is.
If it's not, it should be. Kidding.
It is a, like most fantasy role-playing games, it is a not insignificant portion of the game.
As I kind of describe it, it's the John Woo filmmaking aspect, which is everything goes in super speed, and it's all quick cuts and fast motions and this and this and that, and the plot's over here, the dialogue's there, and then combat happens and everything slows down to slow motion.
Yeah.
So that's how I kind of look at combat in Earthdawn in most games, actually. So where do you want to start? Because it's kind of an all-encompassing thing. I have the combat options chart off the Game Master's screen. We can use that a little bit later, but I think the bare bones basics are this. You have a talent based upon a attribute that you will use to roll some dice, try and hit somebody else's defense, be it physical defense, mystic defense, or in some cases, social defense.
Right, depending on what you're trying to do.
Gist of it right there.
Right.
And then you roll damage, which is your weapon plus 9 times out of 10 your strength, and then take it away from the other person's armor, or the armor takes, hit them for a certain amount of damage. Their armor takes away from that. They may or may not get a wound. And if they do get a wound, they're therefore hindered on their actions and so forth and so on. So it's the gentle whittling down, it's the destructive whittling down of someone else's character or an NPC.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the general flow of combat, kind of looking at it as the combat round, is you start off, and the degree to which this has been emphasized or not in various editions has kind of shifted a little bit. But generally, the first thing that everybody does in a combat round is decide what it is that they're intending to do. And in most cases, that's fairly simple. There's not a lot of elaborate declarations that need to be made. And some people don't even really like having a declarations phase. The primary reason that is kept in 4th edition is because there are some combat options, some tactical choices that you can make that would potentially affect what you roll for your initiative. And so those decisions need to be made before you roll initiative. If you're going to be doing, an aggressive attack or a defensive stance, or using talents that boost, your initiative in some way.
Spring,
Tiger Spring, Air Dance, Cobra Strike. There are some talents that mess around with initiative. And so at minimum, those decisions maybe need to be made before you roll initiative. And it's and even the initiative boosting talents generally, I don't have a problem with people deciding to use those when they are, going to make their initiative roll. But yeah, if I generally feel if you are going to be doing something that is going to affect your initiative, you need to decide that before you actually make the roll. Because,
No. Okay. I get that.
But generally, like some editions, I think Classic and maybe Third to a certain extent was a little bit more formal in their declarations and had penalties where if you changed what you did from what you declared, you had got a penalty to your test or something. I'm not crazy about that. Things are fiddly enough, and it feels like kind of a penalty to people with lower average initiative scores, because they are more likely to be the people that are affected by that over the faster people who can get in and maybe strike down an enemy beforehand. So I'm not a huge fan of. If you want to do that, GM,
go ahead.
Yeah, if it works for your group and that's the way that you've been doing it, fine. Absolutely. It kind of changes the way that combat can flow. If you are going to do something that formal, what you might want to do, that I've seen some people do, not necessarily in Earthdawn, but in some other games, is actually do those kind of declarations after initiative is rolled. And so once you know what order people are going in, perhaps do declarations maybe in a reverse order. So the people that would be acting later in the round declare what they are going after first, so that the people who have the higher initiatives can react to that. Or not. But yeah, the idea of, because you rolled low and what you wanted to do is now no longer possible because of other stuff that has happened, therefore you get penalized. Isn't having a low initiative kind of penalty enough?
I agree. It is.
In its own way. And so that's, to kind of get back to the email, that's the reason why, while we didn't get rid of it entirely, we did try to de-emphasize the declarations phase of the combat round. And if you can get things to work without even having it, great. I just think there are a couple of options that can be chosen that might affect your initiative, and so therefore at least those should be decided or declared ahead of time, and beyond that, whatever.
Yeah. So if you've got some of your players don't even have an initiative boosting talent, then in that case, whatever.
I mean, basically you've got depending on how you build them, warriors will have it. Swordmasters typically will have an initiative boosting talent in 4th edition. Higher circles, you might see Beastmasters with it because I think they might get access to Cobra Strike. They might also get access to Tiger Spring because it's got an animal name. But archers, I think, probably do as well. But like any kind of magician generally, or, non-frontline combatant, any kind of sort of support / specialist type is probably going to have typically their average dexterity rather than going first. And so that's. Go ahead.
One of my players sent me a video about a month and a half ago, right before we started our 4th edition campaign, and he said, this guy's doing a thing on D&D about get rid of your initiative. It's not needed anymore. Do it more cinematic style combat storytelling. It moves a lot faster. And I'm like, yeah, but Earthdawn has initiative dependent talents, and really can't get rid of that here.
I mean, I think one of the things that...
And I think Earthdawn combat is cinematic enough.
Right. I mean, that
you don't need to
whether something is cinematic largely depends on like the amount of description and whatnot that the players and the GM kind of give it at the table. But like one of the popular, like the fact that D&D in its more recent iterations has gone to, and Pathfinder does this as well, has basically gone to a cyclical initiative. That is, you make one initiative roll at the beginning of the combat, and then that determines the order. And then when it gets through, you go back to the top of the order and then go through, so that everybody basically gets turns in the same order. And that does in some ways make it kind of easy to like mark durations of stuff, because it always it goes into effect on somebody's turn and they have so many turns with it. But it affects everybody equally throughout the course of the round. There have been discussions that I have seen come up with perhaps adapting Earthdawn to a cyclical style initiative. And I understand the desire to do that, because rolling initiative every round can, that's an additional die roll. It can take up extra time and blah, blah, blah. But when you're looking at doing something like that, you need to figure out how the initiative boosting talents like Tiger Spring, like Air Dance, like Cobra Strike, though that is less frequent because it's a higher circle talent, but Air Dance especially, because Air Dance, its special thing is if you actually roll high enough with it and you're going fast enough, you get an extra attack, and you need to figure out how those talents are going to interact with a cyclical initiative system. There are some other interesting initiative systems that I've seen out there that don't even necessarily use a lot of dice. There's one that I've seen where it's determined who is basically whoever speaks up first acts first in the first round, and then when their turn is done, they nominate either another player or a NPC to act next, and then that person goes, and then they nominate somebody else, but you can't nominate somebody who's gone before until everybody else has gone once through. And so what you can do with that is that you can set up, oh, well, I'm going to do this thing to set you up, and I'm going to nominate you next so you can take advantage of it. And do that sort of thing. And that's kind of cool, because then what happens is oh, great, maybe you do set it up so that your entire group acts first and does all of their stuff, but then all of the NPCs, all of the enemies maybe get the same kind of thing where they're all acting together before it's I don't know what, I've run into that. I don't know offhand what game handles it. But there are some things like it. But yeah, the Earthdawn initiative system has talents kind of baked into how it functions, and to make alterations to that would require a much more broad-based reconceptualization of how some talents work.
Yes.
Not saying that it couldn't be done, but it would require a tearing things down to a much more basic foundation than they
We'll
exist.
save that for 6th edition, because no, kidding. The only other initiative system I've come across that might help kind of bridge the gap there is the role-playing game Corporation by Brutal Games. They have an initiative system, which is where you roll it once for every single player, including the NPCs, and you only re-roll your initiative once the, air quotes, scene changes. So if the people move apart, if you're running away, or if you change the terrain, or a certain spell would alter the dramatic landscape, yes, reroll your initiative. Now the situation has changed, and then you play a couple more rounds, and then if it changes again, you roll initiative again at that time. So it would spread out the number of times you roll initiative to like once every 3 or 4 rounds versus once every single round.
Yeah.
So that might bridge the gap there. So
that's an interesting idea. So then, once initiatives have been rolled, whether you're using the bonus talents or not, highest result acts first, and you count down from there. Highest, then next highest, then so forth all the way down. Basically when your count in the initiative comes up, you get to take an action, or what's called in the rules formally a standard action, which is like your basic attack, whether that's attacking with a sword or casting a spell or firing an arrow or anything else. And the talents in the game and the skills all indicate whether they are a standard action or not. And then you can take free and or simple actions, subject to the limits of whether other stuff has happened and game master approval and things like that. And then for each action that you are making, you roll the dice for it. You make a test and against the difficulty number, and it either succeeds or fails. If you are making an attack, like trying to hit somebody with your sword, then you roll your melee weapons against their physical defense, as you kind of alluded to earlier. And, based on the success or failure of that, you may do damage. Damage is reduced by armor, and that goes there. The one thing that I do kind of want to call out here, and it's talking about damage a little bit, is the a lot of people who come to Earthdawn from a D&D mindset are used to having like hit points where you have a total, and then each time you take damage, you subtract until you go down to 0. That's not really the way that it is designed to work in Earthdawn. In Earthdawn, when you take damage, you actually are starting from 0 and adding to it to determine what is your current damage. And that gets compared to your unconsciousness or death ratings to determine whether you are still on your feet or not.
Yes.
And it may seem like a semantic difference, but it is kind of important in terms of how the rules are written and how things interact with each other.
So in D&D you count down, and in Earthdawn you count up. Yeah.
And then, of course, you can always, complicate things in combat with a few of the combat options. There are a couple of different stances you can take. Aggressive attack, which gives you bonuses to attack and damage, but at a penalty to your defense, so it makes you easier to hit. There's defensive stance, which basically does the opposite, increases your physical defense rating, but gives you penalties to attack and damage, because basically at that point you're, because you're focused on not being hit. There's like attacking to knock down the enemy, because being knocked down is bad. That's a condition where you suffer penalties to your defense ratings and to your attack steps, and it takes basically your standard action in most cases to get up.
Because you're prone on the ground.
Because you're prone on the ground, and it takes effort to get back up. So there's a bunch of stuff like that, even outside of the like purview of the various talents and abilities that characters can bring to bear in a combat situation. But I mean, much like the kind of core mechanic, the basic flow of combat is fairly straightforward, and where things get interesting is in the interactions of various talents, both for a single character and among characters. And those we'll dive into a little bit more as we start looking at the various disciplines in a bit more depth.
Yeah. And then the two other things about combat I want to bring up real quick. One of them is the secondary attacks. There's a whole slew of talents that provide you, if your initiative is high enough or beats your opponent's defense, that you get a secondary attack. Yeah, then,
we mentioned Air Dance, which is basically if your initiative total is in 4th edition 10 higher than your target, you get an additional. You get an attack. You basically get to attack your opponent again after they've taken their turn. And then, of course, you've got, for the combat types, you've got your second weapon, so you can have a dual wielder. You've got your second attack, which allows you to make an additional attack with your primary weapon. And then when you get into really high circles, you get stuff like Claw Frenzy or multi-attack or multi-shot, where it's possible to be making, like, not just 2 or 3, but perhaps 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 attacks in a single round.
Get to those
the flying buzzsaw of the Claw Frenzy, the Windling with Claw Frenzy.
Yes.
So and those are talents that come in later on as characters gain more experience and players gain more experience. I think one of the nice things about the way that the discipline system works and the design of disciplines is that you don't start off with a whole lot of superpowered stuff right off. You start off with a smaller number of things that you get familiar with, and you add on a couple more each time you gain a circle. And then generally advancing through those first 3 or 4 circles is relatively quick, and that should give you like the foundations of stuff. And then when you get into journeyman circles, you start really getting some impressive tricks and stuff. So there is a real like learning curve that goes along not only as the character develops, but also that the player has an opportunity to do along with that.
Yes, those are fun. And the last thing I need to bring up about combat is wounds.
Wounds,
yes. A nice little wrinkle that I don't think a lot of other games come into a whole lot, but I like the fact that wounds happen in Earthdawn, and I've had a running debate with my players since I've been running this game. I usually win the debate. Is that because falling damage, if you fall, you can take more than 1 wound at a time. And so in some instances where we've had, based on the old system, like the extraordinary success, I would always tack on, you do more than 1 wound. Because if the wound threshold is like, say, 8 and you do 24 points of damage, that NPC or that other character is going to take a second wound or a third wound. So, they refute me.
Yeah, with the rules as written, unless the ability or power or whatever specifically indicates, you will only do 1 wound regardless of how much actual damage you do. If somebody has a wound threshold of 8 and you hit them with your sword and you roll really well and you roll 30 damage after their armor, they still only take 1 wound. I mean, they're going to be hurting because 30 points of damage is going to take a nice hefty chunk towards their unconsciousness or death rating.
Totally.
But it's still only 1 wound. There are some spells and abilities and so forth that specifically indicate that they cause multiple wounds, or like the 4th edition version of Pain causes the effect as if they had multiple wounds.
Yes.
But unless otherwise noted, 1 wound per hit. Now, when you start getting into those higher circles and the multiple attacks, each of those attacks has the potential to generate a wound. So it is possible in those circumstances to cause more than 1 wound in a round to a target, because you are doing multiple hits. But like allowing by default multiple wounds from damage alone basically negates some of the higher circle powers that come into play, which specifically allow you to do that. So that's something to keep in mind. One other thing to kind of talk about changes so if you suffer a certain amount of damage or more from a single hit, that causes a wound. And that wound, basically for each wound, you have a penalty to your rolls. In previous editions, your first wound was free. You didn't have any penalty from the first wound that you suffered. You didn't start suffering penalties until you had your second and third and fourth. Okay. So to get that -1 penalty, you needed 2 wounds and so on.
Yes.
The reason why it was changed in 4th edition, because in 4th edition now you start getting those penalties right from the first wound, is mainly because it's more intuitive. Basically, at that point, your penalty is the number of wounds that you have, rather than needing to remember, you get 1 free, so you need to subtract 1. It's mainly, much like I was kind of talking about with the legend points for karma, it's kind of a bookkeeping thing. It's an easier record keeping thing. I know that there are several people who house rule back to the old way and have the first wound be free. That's fine if you want to do that. And I also think that having the penalty show up right away also makes wounds a little bit nastier. I mean, wounds are generally nasty to begin with, but having the penalty appear right away is makes them a little bit less desirable, a little bit more nasty, and it promotes the use of armor a little bit more, with some of the other changes that we had made to try and make armor a little bit more desirable. So we had talked about in the analysis of like defense ratings, people who have, in theory, people who would have a lower physical defense would want to have would want to wear more armor to make up for that. But a low physical defense in previous editions was more likely to have its armor defeating hit, in which case your armor didn't count anything. And so, like, these are sorts of the like, what does a certain rule setup promote in terms of like build and play options for characters, and having the one wound, like the penalties right off the bat equal to the number of wounds, I think makes them a little bit nastier.
I agree.
Not hugely so. Because, a -1 in penalty is not huge, but, it's a little bit of record keeping thing that I don't think makes a huge difference in terms of the playability of the game, except that basically you don't want to get wounds.
Yeah, because your first wound takes away 1 step on your attack, and 1 step on your avoid blow if you have 1 step on your anticipate blow, 1 step on any talents you're going to use, or any skills you're going to use. So those -1s begin to add up. If you're like, I need to dodge this, never mind, I can't, because I'm down to, I'm down a step lower. Right. By the time you have 2 wounds, you're like, I really don't want to get in the way of this shot anymore. I need to get out of this combat a little bit. So yeah, the wounds, as you said, stack up, and they're pretty nasty when you get there. So yes, avoid wounds at all costs. Buy healing potions, not boosters. Healing potions.
Yeah, healing potions.
Yeah, that's your spend silver.
Salve of Closure is the other one, because that's kind of a middle. It doesn't heal any actual damage, but it will automatically heal a wound. Some stuff like that. I think there's a Questor. One of the Questor of Garland has a power that allows them to heal wounds, and there might be 1 or 2, in other places that do that. I think one of the Nethermancer spells. Allows, maybe it causes a wound and allows a recovery test without actually spending a recovery. I forget. It's the aspect of the evil surgeon. That's not the actual name of it, but that's basically what it is.
There's a reason we wrote it all down in the books.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean that's the basic flow of combat, and then once everybody has taken their turn, counting down to the initiative order, then you start a new round, and everybody rolls a fresh initiative and starts over. It does can sometimes make tracking initiative or tracking durations of stuff a little bit annoying, because depending on how you handle it, it's possible that if you do something like situation where somebody gets knocked down at the end of the round and then happens to roll well on their initiative and is able to get up before anybody can take advantage of it. You can look at some situations like that. Like what happened with old versions of the maneuver talent, for example, where if you acted late in the round, you'd roll maneuver and then hopefully roll really well the next round. And so you could have just a really short period of time with your other physical defense rating to not get hit and stuff. But, generally speaking, most durations now are measured towards the end of the round, even if it ends up making them last a little bit longer, simply so that there is at least an opportunity at least once to take advantage of an effect that might be there.
Cool. Like acrobatic defense.
Like acrobatic defense, although that doesn't... the acrobatic defense, I think, is just good for the remainder of the round in the new version.
Yeah.
There are things like that. But basically things either last until the end of the round, or when we're talking about spell effects and whatnot, typically are until the end of the subsequent round. Usually if you're using it on yourself, it will be until the end of the round. And if you're using it on somebody else, it will be until the end of the next round, just so that there will be an opportunity at least once to take advantage of that on somebody. So
yeah, because magicians don't always go first. So
magicians usually don't go first.
I was trying to be nice. Okay, so anything else about combat? Because we have So we covered armor, which is just a simple deduction. So if you're wearing
it's
hide,
ablative.
which has 4 points of physical, and you take 8 points of damage, you take 4 points off. Your body takes 4 points. That's it.
Five points for hide armor, but yeah,
Sorry,
that's the. I mean, like the exact figures are not as important as the illustration of, if you have 4 points of armor and you take 8, then you only actually take 4 damage, and that applies across the board. We didn't mention extra like if you are doing a melee attack or a physical attack against someone, that the extra successes do additional damage by default. We talked about that a little bit in our discussion of the success levels last time.
Yes.
But that's, basically the idea is if you roll really well on your attack, you end up doing more damage.
And
that's
each success is +2 steps,
plus
right?
2 is the default extra damage on your basic.
Gotcha.
On your basic attack. There are some things that I would rewrite to make that a little bit clearer in the player's guide if I could go back and do it again. Because
we
that
have
was
the podcast to
5
clear
years
that
ago.
up. So
yeah, that was 5 or 6 years ago now, and I've learned a lot about writing rules since then. We have all learned a lot about writing rules since then.
Letter of the
based
law,
on some of the questions
law.
that come out, and we like scratch our heads wondering how did they get that out of what we wrote, and just kind of shrugging and moving on. So yeah, I mean that's generally it. Like the basic concept is fairly straightforward, and once you get familiar with the system, it's actually possible to go through a combat relatively quickly, especially if you have players that know their stuff and what to do. Combat, in 4th edition we have tried to have combat be something that is a little bit faster in the sense, not necessarily of how fast each round plays out at the table, but more that you would typically have fewer rounds of combat that you would play.
Fair.
We have tried to avoid having like super high health totals for creatures, so that so that enemies, that monsters and stuff tend to go down a little bit more quickly. And to have combat in that sense flow a little bit faster, because exploding dice can always turn the tables like remarkably. You can think things are going well, and against what might have otherwise been a fairly mundane encounter, they get a couple of explosions, and suddenly one of your frontline fighters is on the ground, bleeding from a nasty injury. That one of the things, and actually, I think we'll close out with this. Okay, so if you are a GM running combat, keep in mind that player characters are subject to be the victims or targets of a lot more rolls over the course of a game than any individual creature is. Because an individual creature or opponent typically will only show up in 1 or 2 combats, whereas a player character shows up in every combat, basically. And so, generally speaking, it is a lot more likely that a player character is going to be the unfortunate victim of a bad run of exploding dice. And that's fine. That's built into the game. That's part of the design. But that issue gets compounded the more enemies you have in a single combat, basically, because the more rolls you make, the more likely odds are that something is going to explode.
Yep.
And it also, when going up against a whole bunch of weaker opponents, it also might. I talked about this, I think, the other week with like where we went up against a group of relatively low-powered undead, and it still can take time to get through them all, even if you are a group of 5th or 6th circle, characters. And so a larger group of weaker opponents can still be a challenge, just because of the odds of that one freak roll or a couple of freak rolls doing a really nasty thing to an individual player, and keep that in mind. And that leads into discussions at the table of, well, how are we going to handle death at the table? And like, is death on the table in every fight, or is the GM maybe going to fudge things a little bit so that a player is not necessarily like cacked by effectively a random encounter in the woods. Like, what is the level of danger, of fatal danger that is going to be expected in the game? And, that's, again, one of those, like, have everybody on the same page. Because I know people that really like the idea that with the exploding dice, you can have a character die at any moment, even against an encounter that otherwise should be a cakewalk. And I know as well, and I'm more along this line, is I don't really like the idea of random death. I would much rather have death be something that is significant story-wise and has an impact on the story. Now, you can spin a random death to have an impact on the story. I'm not saying you can't do that, but that's just the, like, I don't know. That's the personal style thing. And if everybody's on the same page, great. But that's just something to keep in mind, especially for maybe newer Earthdawn GMs, is that you want to have, you want to be careful when you're throwing large numbers of enemies against your player characters, because you're increasing the chance that you're going to have a freak roll that you would either need to back off or whatever. Once they get high enough and they have enough money that they can have a last chance salve or two on their person, at that point, you can, but yeah, so like that's sort of the broad combat advice that I might advise there.
Yeah, I have leaned toward random death during any combat is just not going to happen, because I'm like, nah, they need to survive this one to get to the big bad, whoever the big bad happens to be. And so at that point, the big bad fights, all bets are off. If you survive, great. If you're dead, that's part of the story, and you get to make a new character and so forth. We did have one where there was an offshoot adventure written called By the Book, and it appeared in like a Shadi magazine way back when, and it took place in the Great Library of Thrall. There was a horror in there called The Unnamer, and the first thing he did was he hit my troubadour in the throat, and that was a career-defining thing, because if the troubadour, I had him roll to see how well his wounds healed, and if he couldn't sing anymore, then he was going to need to change his profession. He was going to need to change his discipline. And luckily or not, he maintained it and he went on from there. But it was the player was bereft. He was beside himself to go, I may have to change my entire character, and I made him for this, and so forth and so on. So it wasn't a death. It was a near death, but it was the first blow struck in that big bad fight. So
yeah,
those are fun.
Death is such an easy threat in some respects. Like, I am much more of a fan of fates worse than death, because when you're dead, you're beyond caring. It doesn't really matter anymore because you're dead.
You just make a new character. You're done.
But when you have a character, like, at that point, the focus and the impact of the death becomes on those who are left behind.
Yes.
But having characters that are, that get out of being dead, then kind of maybe need to deal with the consequences of that. And that's a whole lot, like, we're starting to wander a little bit here. So we'll maybe kind of circle back around to this at another time.
That's the GM advice thing later on.
Yeah.
We'll get that one later on. Death and new character creation. Okay. Aside from that, we've hit an hour and 15 or so, hour and 20. We're getting there. Otherwise, I do still want to thank Josh for making the time to do the podcast with me here. Actually, it was his idea, so I thank him for letting me do the podcast with you here, and we'll go from there. By all means, be active on the forums, like, share, subscribe, all the stuff that keeps the algorithms running. Contact us by all means with any other questions, especially about combat. Combat questions are fun. Here at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Final thoughts, Josh?
No, I think we've kind of covered everything, and I don't want to belabor the points anymore. Next time around, we will start getting into disciplines. We're going to start next week. I think the plan is for Air Sailor. We will talk about them.
And if you think it's alphabetical, you're wrong.
Yeah. Well, not completely alphabetical. Well, we talked about combat, so now next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about a discipline that is combat
oriented,
sort of, at least combat oriented to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And then we will, I think, we'll maybe do a little bit more timeline stuff, and we'll kind of figure things out and go on from there.
Yeah, but don't hold us to that. So, otherwise, folks, thanks for listening. Now go make your own legend.